Welcome to this section on directories, files, and the reading and writing of them on iOS. We're going to cover first of all the file system structure that governs what you can and cannot do with an iOS app. Then we'll look at how to list files and folders on iOS using the system.io.net class. Then we'll have a go at creating and reading some files and directories of our own, and inside of there we can learn how to place our own text into those files and do fancy things like creating a log file that stores times and dates whenever it is fired off. That final point will be a task that I set you that will complete your understanding of this section. Let's look at some of the more common features that we'll need to know in order to work with the file system on iOS. The very first thing you need to be aware of is that your app is sandboxed. What does that mean? Well, that means that your app has its own little container, its own little sandbox, if you will, and it cannot access anything outside of that sandbox. So your app cannot go to another app's container and see what's available there. It also, if it wants to get photos and music from the iOS system, has to ask it using the Apple version of that request. The other thing you have to know on iOS is that all paths are case sensitive. Therefore, lowercase does not equal uppercase when you're defining a path. If you're coming from the classic .NET world and you program on Windows, this will come as a surprise, and most of the time as a nasty surprise in the form of a crash. You have to get the case right. Now there's another little gotcha here, is that if you get the case wrong on the simulator, there won't be a crash. But if you get it wrong on a device, there will be an exception thrown. So just be aware of that, and always, of course, test your app on a real device. Then we need to look at the path separator. So if I had files /something /something, on iOS the separator is a / and not a / like you would have on the Windows operating system. Therefore, if you want to create a directory path or a file path, it's always best to use the system.path.combine function, because that will take into account the OS that you're running on and make your code more portable. This is a major gotcha. Do not try to write to your app folder. So over in the image, you can see your bundle container and you can see your data container. Always write your data to the data container in Documents, Library, or Temp. Do not try to write it to myapp.app. .app is simply a folder in and of itself. But if you try and write to it, you're going to invalidate the signature on it, which means that your app will not run. You probably won't even get past Apple review with an error like that. Finally, in concert with that, store your files in the Documents folder of your data container. So over in the image, you can see Documents, Library, and Temp. Pop it into Documents, and if you so wish, you can turn on iCloud backup for the Documents folder, which means that Apple will automatically back up whatever's in there, and when your user changes device, they can have their info available there too. If you put your data into Library, I wouldn't advise it because that's a special use case and you'll hardly ever need to use that. Don't put your data into Temp unless you want it deleted fairly often. iOS does the occasional sweep to free up space, and the Temp folder of each app is the prime target for that sweep. So if you're caching images, then sure, by all means, put them in the Temp folder. Okay, that pretty much sums up the iOS file system structure. is quite simple because we are sandboxed and we cannot play in any other app's sandbox. Let's move on to listing and reading of files in Xamarin.ios. And of course, we're going to do this by example. So crack open Xamarin, create a new solution of a single view app, and let's call this file system or something similar. And go ahead and create it. Now, when we're accessing files inside of Xamarin, we're going to mostly use the file class and the directory class available in .NET. So let's look at how that works. Let's open up our main storyboard and drop in a button. Somewhere near the top left is fine. Let's give this button a name. Let's call this file button. And of course, let's change the text and say enumerate files. Very catchy title, that. Expand it a bit so it fits. I'm not going to put constraints on this because we don't need it for this tutorial. Now, we can either go ahead and create a connection to this button through our view controller, but we can also just double click it and it opens the view controller and gives us a GUI to insert our event handler. So I'm going to put this right at the top, hit enter, and it creates an event handler for us, which is quite handy. Now inside of this event handler, when we click the button, we're going to enumerate all of the directories inside of our app's main directory. So let's have var entries is equal to directory dot, and then right click directory, resolve using system.io. That stands for input output. Then let's enumerate directories. It asks for an argument of the path. Well, we want the base level path, so that's /. Then let's loop through those entries with a for each var item in entries. And for each entry we have, we're going to do a console.writeLine and print our item out back to us. Right, I'm going to set this going on our iPhone 5, and it should loop through all of the directories we have inside of our app folder. So if I click my application output, it's now running on the sim. And if we come over to the sim and click enumerate, our app output has these two files, main.storyboard and settings.bundle. Now there are only two folders inside of the default folder. So stop this running. And if I right click my solution or my project and I show reveal in Finder, then I browse to the bin, the iPhone sim, debug, right click the app and show package contents. Inside of here, this was classified as a folder, which it is. And then we had one more, which was the settings.bundle. And of course, if we right click that, we can show the package contents of the settings.bundle. So if you're from the Windows world, it's not showing a folder as we might think of it, but it is showing a folder as iOS thinks of it. So what if we want to list all of these files? Well, come over to Xamarin and let's simply change enumerate directories to enumerate files. And then that should print out each file that we have. So I'll run it, click our button, and our application output shows us all of these files we have stored inside of our app directory. So those all match. We have exes and what have you. And of course it doesn't show the folders because we've asked specifically for just files. Right, that's the conclusion of how you access a list of files and folders inside of Xamarin.ios. It's pretty simple to do. Now, what if I want to read a file in Xamarin? Well, let's create something to read. Over in our resources folder, right-click, add, and we would like a new file. Click on miscellaneous and empty text file. Let's call this story.txt. Xamarin will create that, and then let's right-click it, have a build action of content. Okay, so it's there. What I'm going to do is go up to my build menu, not start without debugging, oh dear. Build all. You can also hit Command B to build. And then I'm going to browse over to my debug directory, and I'm actually going to show the package contents. And if I scroll down, we have our story.txt available. Okay, that's great. So content will bundle this into our app's root directory. Let's drop in some text to this story. This course is helpful. And now we have a little bit of text. Then let's head over to our storyboard, drop in another button that will allow us to read the text. Let's call this button, we'll give it a title of read and read button. Now let's double click it to create our event and drop it in to our view controller. Okay, we have our read button, and when we click it, we would like to read all of the text inside of story.txt and print it out. Let's have var text is equal to file dot read. And we have a lot of options here. We can read all bytes, we can read all lines, we can read all text, or just read lines. Now, when you read all lines, it gives you back a string array of each line of your story. All text just gives you everything that it's found. And read lines reads lines one by one. So let's have read all text. And we need to pass it a path. Well, this is going to operate on the assumption that the path of our app is the root directory, because if you remember, we're sandboxed. So as far as it knows, nothing else exists outside of this directory. So let's have story.txt, and then let's have console.writeline, our text. And let's hit play. And now when I click that read button, it should grab the text from story.txt and print it out to our console. So I've clicked it, and the app output has read me back all of the text inside of that file. Okay, so that works. Now, what if we wanted to read this file line by line? Well, let's put a couple lines in. Let's have new line 2 and line 3, ... Let's save that. And now what we can't see in this file is the fact that the operating system is adding a new line character to the end of each of these lines. So first of all, I just want to run it with read all text and see how that gets translated back to us when we have these new line characters. So read, app output, and it's read all the text. It also reads the new line characters, so it knows where it is and it prints out accordingly. Okay, now if we read all the lines, so let's have file.read all lines, then what we would have is a for each loop. Let's have var line in text. We can then run through each line that gets extracted one by one. So I'll hit play. And if you were building something like a log, for example, this is how you would do it. You'd put a new line character on, so you could actually pull out each line as you went along. So let's hit read, and the app output should have 3 console write lines, whereas before we only had 1 console write line, that new line the characters. This has 3 because we've created an array for each new line. Alright, that is basically how you read a file such as a text file. You can of course read other files. You can get things like read all bytes and get a basic byte stream or an array, and then once it's read a file, it closes the file for you afterwards, so you don't have to manually do that. Just bear that in mind. If you go a bit lower level with file reading, you will have to close the file yourself, so it's accessible by other elements when you fire them off. Okay, that sums up how to read a file in Xamarin.ios. So far we've learned how to read a file, but what if we want to actually create a file or create a directory in Xamarin? Well, let's try that. Let's open up our storyboard and drop in another button. And of course we will call this create item and give it a name, create button. I'll just expand it a little. Okay, double click it to create the event and drop it in wherever you like inside of View Controller. Now inside of here, the first thing we have to do is grab our documents folder, because if you recall, I said if you're going to create a file, always store it in documents, library, or temp. Do not try to store it inside of your apps folder. So let's have var documents is equal to, and there's a special way of retrieving this folder, and this comes under environment dot get folder path, and you'll notice it's got the environment dot special folder argument. So let's give it exactly what it wants, environment dot special folder, and if I scroll through, we can go to admin tools, CD burning, common music, etc., etc. We don't want any of those. We just want environment.specialfolder.my documents. There it is. And now we have a link to it. Let's create the file name of the file we're going to create. Var file name is equal to, and let's use path dot combine documents and the name of our file. Let's have new story.txt. So if you recall in earlier lectures I said always use path combine, because in iOS the / is expected for file path separators, whereas on other platforms the / is what's expected. So path.combine takes care of the correct formatting for us. That just makes your code a bit more portable. Now we have the file name. All we have to do is write all text. File.write all text, and this creates a new file, writes the specified string, and then closes the file. If the file already exists, it is overwritten. Just be aware of that. Write alt text, and let's have our file name and some contents. Well, this course is still awesome. Let's run this. And when we click the create button, our text file will be created. Then once we've done that, so I'll just click it, I'm then going to navigate to the file structure of this simulator so we can see what this looks like. Let's find where it is. So open up a new file browser. So hit go. Let's go to folder. Let's have /users /your username /library /developer. And here we have all of our simulators stored in, I believe, core simulator. Hit devices, and we have every device imaginable under the sun. So how do we know which is ours? Well, we could probably click by date modified. I'm going to assume this top one is ours, but there are two. So let's come across to Xamarin, open the app output, and we have a loaded assembly in the simulator that starts with D7B. So that is actually the top one. So let's open up our data folder. And we have a lot of things in here. Let's have containers. We have data. We have application. And I believe we might want to get this one that was modified at 1542. If we open it, go to Documents, we have newstory.txt, which has the text that we've put inside it. So here you can see our data is stored inside of a Documents folder. Okay, let's stop that running. Now let's mix it up a little bit. Let's create a directory as well as this file. So we already have my documents special folder. We have our file name. So let's create one that puts in a directory name. Var directory name is equal to the path dot combine. Let's have documents, and then we need a directory name. So let's call this stories. Then we don't use the file class, we use the directory class to actually create directories. Create directory, pass it in the directory name. So if I hit play now, this will get uploaded and create a directory for stories, as well as newstory.txt outside of that directory. So create, and let's see if this has been modified here. And there we have a stories directory with nothing inside it. Right, your final tip for this little lecture is that a lot of the system input-output in .NET will actually take care of directory creation and file creation for you. So some of this might be a bit redundant, but in other cases you might have to manually create it. It's time for a task. This is the best way to apply your knowledge. What I would like you to do is create a button. Then what I want you to do is create a non-blocking loop that runs every second for 5 seconds. Non-blocking loop, let's just type this down for you, that runs every second for 5 seconds. Then inside of that loop, you're going to print the current date time to a log file. Something like log.txt, but it can be named anything you like. Of course, you're going to store that file inside of documents for your app. That's your task. Please have a go at it before you look at the next lecture. Let's create the solution to your task, which is to create a loop that goes around every second for 5 seconds and writes a date time to a file. First, let's create the button that fires this off in our main storyboard. Button, and what should we call this? Let's call this log, not lof, log loop. Okay, and I'll just show you what happens when we double click this, but we don't give it a name. Xamarin will create its own name for you. So I'll just pop this in there, and it's called something very recognizable like UI button 25. And of course, that's bad news if you are a programmer and you come back to this much later on. You won't know what that means. Right, inside of here, we're going to create our little function. Now, in the project brief, I said this must be a non-blocking loop. That means we have to take it off of the UI thread. So let's have a var task is equal to task. In fact, we don't need to create a var task. We can just go ahead with a task dot. Let's right click it, resolve threading tasks. Dot factory dot start new. So asks for an action. Let's go ahead and give it one. Okay, so now we're off the main thread. Let's create our task. Let's grab the var file path is equal to path dot combine, and we want the environment dot get folder path, which is the environment dot special folder dot my documents. Then we need a file name to add to this inside of our path combine. Let's have log.txt and close off our bracket. Okay, we have our file path. What do we need to do next? Well, I'm going to show you a redundant check because, like I said previously in other lectures, the system I/O will create directories and files for you if they don't already exist. But just in case you want to know how, I'll show you how to check if it does exist. So if, and exclamation means doesn't, file dot exists, and pass it over the path, file path. So if it doesn't exist, then go ahead and file dot create the file path. So like I say, those two lines are redundant, but it just gives you an idea of how to do it. Now let's make our little 5-second loop for var I equals 0 until I is less than 5, I plus plus, so it'll go around 5 times. We need a var time that we're going to write to our file equals date time dot now, and this gives us the current date time, but it gives us it back in a date time which is not a text format, obviously. So there's a couple of nice helper methods inside this date time class. We can have two long or short date string. Let's have a short date string, or even better, a short time string. Right, we have our time. Then we're going to add this into our text document. So we're going to have file.add append all text. So you'll see in the summary here it says it opens a file, appends the string, and then closes the file. If the file doesn't exist, it creates the file, writes the string, and then closes. So again, my file exists check is a bit redundant here. So appends all text, it wants the file path, and it wants the contents. So let's have time, and then we can add something like a separator of a comma or an asterisk, whatever you prefer. You can also put a new line separator in there. Now we want this to run every second, so let's make this thread go to sleep every 1000 or for 1000 milliseconds. And I think if I right click it, we need to resolve using system threading. Once that loop has run, let's see what that file looks like. Let's have console dot write line and grab our file dot read all. Let's see, read all text. There we go. Pass it over the file path, and we should have a complete function. So when I click the button, it's going to run through this loop, open the text file, append it and close it, sleep for a second, and finally, once it's run through that loop 5 times, it's going to output all of the text that we put in. Whoops, I've just got a horrible error somewhere. That looks like I've left a comma or a bracket out somewhere. I don't know if you can see this. You're probably looking at my screen, screaming out, saying, yeah, I can see it. Sort it out. In the task factory start new, I actually need to close off my curly brace, my bracket, and my semicolon. There we go. That works now. So click the log loop, come back to Xamarin, application output, and wait for it. After about 5 seconds, we have our little console.writeLine. So we have 423, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 short date strings that have been output. And all the time that's running, I still have the availability of, let me just remove this, of using the main thread of my app. So if I just show you what that looks like in real terms, if I click log loop, I can still create an item, read, and enumerate. Nothing is becoming blocked within my application. So I've read everything, but even so, that background thread is still running. Okay, that concludes the solution to your log file creation task. Congratulations! You've finished this section on directories, files, reading and writing in iOS. You've learnt, first of all, the file system structure and the uniqueness of the file system inside of the iOS app ecosystem. You then had a go at listing the files and folders stored in the main directory of our app. You also learnt how to create and read files line by line or all of the text. You also learnt how to create directories, and I showed you that the System.io class most of the time will create the directory for you as a quick way to make sure the path exists. Finally, I set you a task, which was to create a log file that recorded the time from a background thread that looped every 1 second. I also included the solution to the task, and I hope you didn't look at that solution before you had a go yourself.